Hoy, en Pensadores Contemporáneos, exploramos la ciencia como narración y su capacidad para conectar con las emociones humanas. Nos acompaña Hassun Zafar, director ejecutivo de Edinburgh Science, una organización líder en divulgación científica. Hassun ha dedicado su carrera a fusionar ciencia, arte y cultura, creando experiencias que trascienden los métodos tradicionales de comunicación científica. Su instalación Here es un ejemplo de cómo el sonido y la proyección pueden contar historias sobre la pérdida auditiva y la biodiversidad, sensibilizando al público de manera profunda. Además, con Mirpur, The Atlantis of Kashmir, utiliza la realidad virtual para reconstruir comunidades desaparecidas, demostrando cómo la tecnología puede preservar la memoria colectiva. Como educador y defensor de la inclusión, Hassun ha trabajado con diversas instituciones para hacer la ciencia accesible a todos, independientemente de su origen o capacidad. Hoy, su voz nos invita a imaginar una ciencia que no solo se entiende, sino que también se siente y se vive como parte de nuestras historias más personales y compartidas.
¿Qué tal? Soy José Gordon, curador de la LEF, y nos encontramos en el programa Grandes Pensadores de TV UNAM para hablar precisamente de este Festival de Ciencia y Arte de la UNAM, cuyo tema central son las redes. Y en este marco contamos con la presencia de Hassun Zafar, quien es director, productor e innovador que trabaja en la intersección entre ciencia, arte y la posibilidad de conectar con los públicos, ya que estamos hablando de conexiones. Hassun, welcome to this program.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to be here.
Well, Hassun, Milan Kundera had this beautiful process of creating a character,
Yes.
finding 3 or 4 words
Mm-hmm.
that characterize the person that he's trying to depict.
Mm-hmm.
So, which would be these 3, 4 words that could define who you are?
Wow, it's a very powerful question. Of course, we're all very sophisticated individuals, so finding 4 words is very difficult. But if I had to choose, I would probably go with adventure, curiosity, compassion, and ideation.
Ideation. So let's start with adventure.
I think life is one big adventure. Like there are so many different chapters and episodes that you're going to have throughout. And also it's what makes life such a thrill. Whether that's work, whether that's personal life, whether that's projects that you're delivering, if you see everything as an adventure and almost akin the hero's journey to that adventure, I know that it's going to have some ups, it's going to have some downs, everything shall pass, and you've got this final destination to get to, but then you remember that the destination is the journey. The journey is the destination, and that allows you to keep going.
Like Kavafi's poem. Yes?
Exactly.
And in this way, you also are marked by the word curiosity. Let's talk about it.
Look, I've had a wonderful career in all about sparking people's curiosity around the world, and about themselves, and about communities. And I think that curiosity is almost a seed that allows us to become discoverers, to become explorers, to become inventors, to push the boundaries of what we feel is impossible or possible. And I think that that's probably what I've always felt that I've been able to have the ability to have the luxury to do, or fortunate enough to be able to do, is be able to have that curiosity to go, why not try something different? Let's try something better. Let's try to push ourselves a little bit further. And I think that curiosity, asking questions, knowing that actually the more questions that you ask, the more answers you're not going to get, the more questions you're going to have to ask again, is such an important part of being curious about the world. And I guess, the quite epitomized by the fact that the more you know, the less you know. Like the more you understand about the world, the less you realize you actually know about the world.
And in this way, your journey also has to do with awakening this curiosity in other people. You began as a teacher.
I did begin my career as a teacher, and it feels like a very long time ago, but I think that I found a great sense of purpose as somebody who was able to spark curiosity and bring to life what seemingly felt like an innate subject in schools. I think that it's a travesty when science is presented in schools in a way which is just a collection of facts and figures. I was really, really I felt that it was a real big, important mission for me to ensure that people didn't think that science was a collection of facts and figures, but it was an exploration of the universe. And how could you do that when a child is sitting in a classroom with four-walled rooms and they have a projector screen in front of you and a whiteboard and a pen? And I thought, you know what, that's where there's going to be an element of imagination, an element of skill, and an element of theatre that we're going to bring to every single class to make sure that every child feels that science is for them. And then when they walk out of that class, they're going to be feeling, how can I get back into this science class? That was the mark of success. When you knew that children wanted to come back into the science class, they couldn't wait to be in the next science class.
What did you do to do that?
Look, Maya Angelou had this beautiful quote where she said, people forget what you said, they forget what you did, but they never forget how you made them feel. And I think that when children enter a classroom, you have to understand that that is going to be the biggest takeaway, how they felt in that classroom. Did they feel excited? Did they feel a sense of enjoyment? Did they feel that they want to be there again? And I felt that as a teacher, I had this great sense of responsibility. There are children in front of me, 1 hour of their life is in my control. And I had to ensure that whatever I was about to do was something that was worth their time, worth my time, but not just something that would enable them to pass an exam, but for them to be able to explore the universe on their own accord. So, look, there were many ways that you could do this. We could look at the research and look at what are the barriers to science education. And using the research, you can create interventions. Now, we don't have time to go through all the research points, but one of them, for example, is perception. Children already have a perception of what a scientist is, what they look like. And one of the activities I used to do, my children, first lesson they come in, I used to give them a piece of card and I said, draw me a scientist. And it was all the children, they would draw a Einstein type figure, somebody in a lab coat, a man, wacky hair. And I'd say, okay, cool, we're going to keep that at the front of your book. Now, at the end of the year, I'd say, go and get that piece of card again, go on the other side and draw me a scientist. And I knew that the year had been a success when the children drew themselves.
Oh, that's beautiful, because that means that education gets its purpose when you really apprehend knowledge and it's yours. It's not in another body, in another person, but you are looking to the world through another lenses.
Absolutely. The ability to give people agency and to empower them to feel that this knowledge is for them to use and access and enhance their lives with is so critical. And I think that in many ways, another barriers to science is that people do not see the real world application of it. Because if you present science as a collection of facts and figures, so what? Force equals mass times acceleration. How does that impact my life, right? And I think that was another key element, is that every part of the curriculum, look at it and go, where is this applicable in a children's life, in your life, in my life, in society, right? So, and if you're able to do that, then you're able to hopefully get to a point where people do not see science as something that only happens in classrooms. They don't just see science as something that happens in laboratories. They don't just see science as something that happens on a TV show. They see science in every single part of their lives. And that's important, because when it comes to global challenges that we face and global solutions that we need to create, people need to see that these solutions are not just massive things that are beyond them. They're the small things that they can do. They're the small things that amount to larger, like a snowball effect. And these small actions that people could do, these small understandings that people have of science, can amount to great transformative changes in society.
How does this curiosity awaken in you? Because this is also a journey,
yes,
that has to do with personal engagement with science. When you discover the amazement of trying to find some facts about the new universe and really you were shaken by that?
Yeah, I was quite fortunate that my mother was very keen to ensure that unlike many children my age, I didn't grow up with a TV in my house. And so my mum brought me loads of encyclopedias. So I ended up reading a lot of encyclopedias when I was young. So that's one part. And I think also I was always a hands-on person. My grandfather was a carpenter. So I always was doing lots of hands-on activities at home. I was also very fortunate to have a brilliant science teacher in school, Mr. David Bose. And he was also the school's head teacher, which meant that we felt that we had access to power in school. But he was fantastic in making sure that we had hands-on science experiments, that we were always able to ask questions and he was able to give us answers. He made us do group work, collaborative work, but also independent work. But he really believed in us too. And he gave us that uplift when he made us realize that science wasn't just about an exam. It was about the curiosity of understanding the world around us. And I think that curiosity for me led me to go, actually, I really love this thing called science. And I continued it through school. And it's really interesting when I observe like my feedback from school papers now, my school reports. I look at the certificates I used to get, and interestingly, I used to get certificates for chemistry, but also certificates for drama. And I was like, why was I getting certificates for drama? I didn't read it, and I used to think that maybe because drama was something that I was well behaved in, and chemistry something I was very clever in. But I think it might have been the other way around. I'm not sure, but it's. I think the curiosity is also rooted in faith. It's also rooted in upbringing. I think we were always told to be curious about the universe. We were always told to ask questions. We were always told to be critical. And even from the smallest things, like science isn't just something about going and looking at a textbook. We were told, go and look at the stars. Go and look. You go to your garden and go and see the animals that are living inside the woodlands near you. Go and see the beetles and the bees and the spiders who are inside your garden. Go and plant a seed and see how it grows. If you plant it a certain different way, does it grow differently? All these things I was really encouraged as a young person to do all of this. And I think that's owing to my teachers and my parents.
And talking about your teacher, this director, it's interesting because education is also about mirror neurons.
Yes.
Which you see in the other eyes.
Yes.
That models you also to have the same kind of knowledge and the same kind of spirit that nurtures this gaze.
Absolutely. And I think that there is definitely something from the teachers that I had, because it wasn't just one teacher. Mr. Bose was one of them, Miss Bates was another, and Miss Mackey, who was my form tutor again. All these teachers, Mr. Naveed, the fact that I remember their names is quite extraordinary. Yeah. I think all of them never underestimate the ability of someone else believing or someone believing in someone. Right? Never underestimate the ability to believe in someone and how much that can uplift them and make them believe in themselves, especially young people. Young people sometimes do need that small amount of positive information to tell you that you're good at this, you can do this, and that encouragement. Sometimes it doesn't even need to be verbal. That does kind of really transform where people can go in life.
And the other thing that made you with the spirit of knowing and finding beauty was drama and art. How that began also in your life?
Well, I always loved reading stories. I was, these encyclopedia sets I had, I remember actually always going to the story sections and reading all the stories. So I ended up reading huge canons of work. And I think that I was always intrigued by the fact that stories transcend a lot of time, transcend space-time, I would say, actually, in many ways. It's quite a fascinating...
You can have a dialogue with Plato.
Quite literally, right? And also the fact that there is a question to be posed. Is the world made out of atoms or is the world made out of stories?
Right? Beautiful question.
And so I would prescribe to the opinion that the world is made out of stories. Because if anything, we are lifeless atoms, apparently. And so what are we? We are the stories that we know and the stories that we tell and the stories that we live in the form of memories and forms of legacies. And so I think that when it came to a point where I was looking at how do we communicate science? How do we need to communicate science? How do we have the greatest amount of impact that we need to have communicating science? I found storytelling as a really powerful mechanism that it was not new, something that actually has always been there, throughout the whole course of human civilization that we have used to transcend knowledge. And I thought that there's something there to unpick on the art of storytelling and how we do science communication.
And there is this interesting fact about the brain.
Yes.
That David Eagleman, the neuroscientist, would say that the information that goes through the senses and gets to the eye and then to the cortex, visual cortex, is the ways that go from inside to the outside are much more dense than the ones that comes from the outside to the inside. This is called the inner model.
Okay.
And the inner model is made of stories.
Wow.
No, because
Yeah.
inner model is the things that you're expecting to see.
That's really interesting, because in the theory of how Edinburgh Science does its immersive workshops, Edinburgh Science Festival for Children, we have the Discovery Lab program. And if you were to apply that in a neuroscience theory, it's called the transformation effect. The idea that if you are able to build a narrative around the science that you're communicating and place the individual into that narrative, they are able to show more empathy, have more agency, and build more memory around that experience. So Discovery Lab has, for example, this workshop that we've been running for 25 years. It's called ER surgery, and children go into a surgery environment which is dressed up like a surgery environment. They meet their facilitators who are dressed like doctors and surgeons. They put on the surgery equipment. They then use surgical equipment to create and do a actual operation on a mannequin, and but they're guided through it. And we have worst case scenarios now, situations where we have people have contacted us saying, X number of years ago, maybe 20 years ago, I did this workshop. And because of this workshop, I am now a doctor.
Oh,
Right. So there is, this transformation effect is a very real thing, and we use it in all of our workshops. So if we're going to do a workshop about satellites, teaching children about satellites, they go into a space station. We've made it look like a space station. They meet people who are just like astronauts, and they make a satellite. These children are only 8 or 7 or 5 years old. And if you're going to go into a paleontology exhibition or workshop or digging up a dinosaur, you meet someone who's dressed as a paleontologist, and you dig up a dinosaur in an environment that looks like you're in the middle of Arizona. These transformation theories, this is using theater. It's essentially theater, but giving it a scientific narrative and placing children into the heart of that narrative so that they feel, like goes back to that quote I said about Maya Angelou, like, they may forget what you said, they may forget what they did, but they never forget how you made them feel in that particular moment. And if they feel at that particular moment, science is for me, I can do science. This isn't a daunting thing. This isn't something for, incredible geniuses. This is for me. They can walk out of Discovery Lab knowing that. That's a success.
That's incredible. And you are also trying to experiment with children. How do you perceive the world with your expectations? Because you say that you once developed a box in which people try to find out what was inside the box, and this narrative it has to do with expectations you have.
Yes.
The inner model.
Absolutely. So this was something that I developed when I was a student, and it was a science lecture / show called What Is This Thing Called Science? And I really wanted to pose that particular question. It was one of the first questions I used to ask students. It's a question I asked my staff member, like, what is this thing that we call science? Because all of us have different answers to that question. And also, because of the limitations of English, science as a word is very restricting to actually really explain what science actually is. Now, I find that the art of demonstration to explain something is a beautiful form of mechanism to explain things. The tradition that was followed by Michael Faraday in the Royal Institution, he used to use demonstration a lot. So this demonstration was a very simple demonstration. You could do it at home. I would get a box and I would cover it up so you couldn't see what's inside. And before I'd covered it up, I'd put some things inside the box. And there were many different boxes. And then I would, as the activity for the children or for the participants, ask them, you must find out what's inside the box, but you are not allowed to open the box. And you can do anything that you can, but you're not allowed to open it. And so the children would, or the participants, they would throw the box up, they would shake it, they would smell it, they would do lots of different things. And then they would write down, I think this box is empty. I think this box has water inside it. I think this box has pencils inside it. And at the end, I would go, when they think they're going to get the answer, they're waiting, what's the answer? I would say, you will never know what's inside the box. And they'd be like, what do you mean we'll never know? Also, this is science. The universe, we are, in comparison to cosmological time, geological time, humans are not going to be here for very long at all. We haven't been here for very long. Individuals will not be here for very long at all. We will never truly understand the beauty and the wonders of the universe. We will try our best, but the limitations that we will always have is our experiences. So when you picked that box up and you were shaking it and you went, that's definitely pencils. The reason why you were certain that it's pencils is because you have once in your life somehow had a box with pencils inside and you shaked it and you've heard pencils, or you know what a pencil sounds like inside the box. If you had never had that experience, how would you know it's a pencil? And this is the same when you apply to science. When you apply to any theory of science, we are limited by experiences of ourselves and others and what's been documented. And that's fine. That's absolutely fine, because what does it pursue us to do? To have more experiences, to have more adventures, to go out and seek more answers.
And to have more imagination, because you have to break paradigms.
Absolutely.
Because the senses tell us something that nature plays in another way.
Absolutely.
We see the sun coming down, but it's not moving.
No.
So we have to go beyond our perception, our senses. And this lets us talk about imagination and reimagination.
Yes.
How can we do it? How do you define imagination?
Look, one of my favorite quotes from Einstein is that he said that science can take you from A to B, or logic can take you from A to B, but imagination can take you anywhere. Oh. And the great thinker Sir Ken Robinson, he had a fascinating talk that really informed me as a teacher, and it still informs me as a practitioner of science engagement today, in which he references a longitudinal study which was done on school children. And I advise you to go watch it. But from recall, you would ask children how many things they could do with a paperclip. And then you would ask the same child the same question once they had completed schooling. Now, when the child was a young child, they would tell you 1,000 different things that you could do with a paperclip. But then when the child had grown up, the same child would tell you only a couple of things, maybe 1 or 2 or 3. And he referenced that one of the reasons why this was happening is because when children are very young, they have a huge amount of imagination. But one of the things that unfortunately schooling can end up doing is taking imagination out of you, because you're told there's only ever one answer. You're told that there's only a certain way of doing things. So these children, when they were young, when you asked them how many things you could do with a paperclip, they were thinking, what size is this paperclip? What's it made of? And using these questions, they go, you could do so many things with a paperclip. But when the children were older, they only have thought of the paperclip as the paperclip they've seen. And so I think that imagination is everything. It's the ability for us to really transcend the parameters that we place upon ourselves. And if you think about it, every single scientific discovery, every Nobel Prize winner, every aha moment that has pushed human civilization forward has always been a product of imagination. So for us to think in any way, shape, or form that science is not a product of imagination is so far away from the truth. If anything, science is the most important product of imagination, because it's taking imagination and going, let's think, how do we make sense of this imagination? And it pushes us forward through the most beautiful ways.
And in this way, pushing imagination means also to go beyond the divide or the gap between science and art. C.P. Snow has said that there is a divide, and that we can have a third culture. And you're displaying in your work this third culture, interconnecting science and art, but also with another important theme: social engagement. Let's talk about it, because when we talk about a third culture, we usually just think about science and art, but we don't talk about compassion.
Yes.
And we don't talk about the engagement and the transformation in people's lives.
Yes. So one of the things that we have to recognize that science is in many ways a social construct too. And in being a social construct, the knowledge that we choose, the places that we go, this is the right knowledge, this is the knowledge that we're going to put on a higher scale, is influenced by our social construct that we have made around it. And in doing so, we have to recognize that there are particular groups, demographics, parts of the world that have been left behind, or in many ways have been marginalized by this dominant tradition of what we call science. And I think that it's incredibly important that we recognize the social constructs that we apply in science. And I'll give you some examples, right? I was giving a talk a while ago in London at the Royal Society about decolonizing science. And an example that I gave was, look, we tell ourselves myths in science all the time. I'll give you an example. We tell children and ourselves that once upon a time, Isaac Newton was sitting under a tree, an apple fell on his head, and lo and behold, gravity was discovered. We tell ourselves Michael Faraday walked into a laboratory one morning, he played around with some magnets, some electric currents, and some mercury, and lo and behold, the motor was discovered. We tell ourselves Louis Pasteur, pasteurized milk, and he invented pasteurization. And we know for a fact that this stuff is a myth. We know that they were not working alone. We know that there was a huge encyclopedia of knowledge that they were working with from across the world. There were global contributions that led to that moment, which we know as Thomas Kuhn's revolution, right? Even if that was the moment of a revolution. Now, it's also worth noting that all those examples that we give are of a particular demographic in a particular space. And almost we are not even attempting to look at the scientific contributions of civilizations that did not come from those spaces, mainly in this particular instance, Europe. And so we are giving ourselves a massive, massive injustice. We are denying ourselves a huge corpus of knowledge by going, we are not going to even look at the knowledge, the scientific knowledge of African civilizations, of Latin American civilizations, of the Asian civilizations. We're not even attempting to look at it right now. I think only 5% of the library of Timbuktu has been transcribed and translated. 5% of one of the largest Asian libraries in the world. It's unvaluable that we are led ourselves to this place. So I think that the next phase of science engagement is going to be look at your audiences and think about how can you engage science with them, but also allow them to engage with science and make you effectively understand the power dynamic that's at play here. Science engagement has traditionally been done in a very didactic way. The scientist comes on stage and goes, I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know about the universe. But perhaps there is now something that we go, perhaps the community can tell us a bit about science that we never really thought about. And I'll give you a story that I came across. I think it's Harry Cliff's book, Space Oddities. It's about the Hubble space image, the deep Hubble space image. Mm-hmm. And when I came from another part too. So I was doing some work with the scientists at the SKAO observatory. I did VR experience with them. And one of the stories that I was told by the production crew is that when the indigenous people were told that this radio telescope was going to be built on the land, they said, what are you building it for? We're looking at the stars. And they said, it's interesting because indigenous communities in that part of the world, they would find more interest in looking at the dark spots of the sky. So the space between the stars is what they found.
It's more important.
Yes, they found that. And they said, that's what space what we look at. Now, the story goes in the Hubble space, there's famous image from the Hubble Space Telescope, is that the lead astronomer at NASA was trying to justify the telescope taking the image at the darkest spot of the sky. And he was really struggling to get justification to go, out of all the sky, I want to look at the part where there's nothing. And so I'm told, the story is that it was on Christmas Eve or something. There was a day that NASA wasn't really working that much, and they thought, actually, go on, you can take a look at that part of the sky. And when he did, he took the image of one of the most important telescope images that we've ever taken. And I think if we take that story full circle, the indigenous communities of Australia were telling us something that we just went, Well, that's funny to know. But what they were telling us was something that would now enhance our understanding of the universe like never before. So when I talk about the hierarchy of knowledge, once we break that hierarchy of knowledge, once we recognize that actually there are places and spaces where science has happened and it can contribute to what we know to be science today, and it will enhance our understanding of science, I think we will enter a new phase of acknowledging how the universe works and perhaps enter a new phase of how we choose to apply science and technology in society.
And you know, in drama, it happens something similar, something akin, because it's not in words, it's in the silences where the drama is.
Yes, that's a really, really good point. And when I started with the theatre, someone told me that silence is very, very powerful. And again, it's that the feeling, the fact that we want to just speak and fill words comes from a certain tradition. It comes from a certain culture. And some cultures actually, you know, as you said, the silence is the most powerful thing you can do.
And you know, also one theme that is common to science and art is that there is an investigation or research into the hidden mechanisms or the invisible side of the visible in science and art. And this takes us to the storytelling. The storytelling you're doing that try to incorporate these silences, these places where you don't see anything, but there is maybe the cue.
Yep.
And let's talk about different ways in which you have immersed in this kind of new narratives. Let's talk about your work at Edinburgh Science Festival.
Yes.
And the thought-provoking activities and strategies that you place to awaken this feeling of seeing beyond the evidence.
Well, look, the first thing is that we market ourselves as a cultural event. So what you do not want to happen with a science festival is it becomes a bit like Comic-Con. And nothing to say bad about Comic-Con, but the reason why people go to Comic-Con is because they like comics.
Yes.
Now, the mistake that science festivals can make is that you make a science festival for people who like science.
Exactly.
You need to make a science festival for everybody. Yes. Yeah. So that's one key element. So then that now goes into programming. So how are you going to program things? There's one way that you can go, well, I'm going to program lots of scientists to come give talks. That's good. Maybe there's a market for that. But what we are really curious with is going, how can we help these scientists transform their talks into cultural experiences that allow people to engage with their research like never before. So this year, for example, we collaborated with the James Hutton Institute. They do a lot of forensic science. And they pitched an idea to us where they were like, we want to bring together our scientists to showcase how we solve a forensic science case. And it was very good lecture if you were at university, but we felt actually there's something here which we can make even better. So we said, why don't you let us make a theatre piece out of this? But not in a way that is a show, but in a way which has got a narrative. So they said, well, let's try give it a go. So we gave this narrative where the lecture is introduced by an inspector. And the inspector takes the audience with him and he goes, listen, we found a forensic case. And we need to walk through how we are going to solve this forensic case. And I'm going to introduce these forensic scientists one by one. And they're going to explain to me their role in this forensic case. And when they say something that I don't understand, you know what? I'm going to ask them, no, sorry, scientist, can you just tell me what that means? Because I don't understand. I don't think the audience do either. And by doing this, you create this really powerful narrative that instead of somebody coming and giving you a lecture, it's actually bits, parts where people are having this engagement and they know when, for example, an acronym comes out or whatever the acronym would be, the inspector goes, sorry, stop there. What does that acronym mean? Or, what kind of, what does it mean when you say you use this particular map and you use this particular software? What does that mean? And by having that third space where you had that questioning, we were able to create a really powerful narrative piece around the forensic science work that James Hutton Institute do. Now, that's one example. There's another example is Bob Cook from Quantinium. He has done a fantastic piece of work where he has been able to get children as young as 15 to understand quantum mechanics in a way that allows them to pass a postdoc Oxford quantum exam just by following a summer school that he did over the summer. And he does this by doing what he calls quantum in pictures. Instead of doing quantum mechanics in mathematical calculations, you do it through imagery. right? And now that it's imagery, and he calls it spiders and wires. You use spiders and wires to do quantum calculations, and it comes out with perfect accuracy. And in addition to that is now the state of the art. So now even when you go into quantum calculations done by researchers, they are not doing mathematical calculations. They're using quantum imagery to do their calculations. Now, we asked Bob to come over and explain quantum in pictures, and he went one step further because he's also a rock star. He likes to make music. So he decided to explain quantum mechanics to us by playing heavy metal rock music, right? So you go to a rock concert to understand your quantum mechanics. These are examples that we can use to be able to explain the world around us. There was another lecture that we did with Alex Baker, which was he's a professor in chemistry at Warwick University. But instead of going, hey, Alex, why don't you come and tell us about your research in the way that you do an entire lecture? We actually went, why don't you do a lecture called The Chemistry of Star Wars? So you use Star Wars and you use the science fiction of Star Wars to bring back people to the research that you're doing on, which is actually on healthcare drugs and the transportation of healthcare drugs. So there was a really powerful mechanism there using cultural experiences. So this is the art of how we use our festival. We create transformative cultural experiences. We use art as a medium to make less intimidating spaces where people are able to come and enjoy science on their terms, in their space, in their way.
And to engage.
And that is the most powerful thing, that you have this engagement and it's transformative. We recognize that not everyone is supposed to be a scientist, but everyone can be a social, scientific, literate citizen, and everyone can use science to inform their lives, and everyone can use scientific information to inform policies. And by doing that, we can create a transformative society that uses science for good.
Yes, and in this way, you're also a kind of spy of nature, and this brings curiosity to the forefront. But then, one very important thing in your work is it also has to do with doing theater in order to see how the paradigms that we're having on climate change have an effect in our lives, and we don't see what is happening. And with theater, for example, you wrote a play that is called There Is No Planet B.
Mm-hmm.
So this means that also this amazement can translate to be put to understand what are the problems we're having now as a planet, as a society. Let's talk about, for example, this theater, this play.
Yeah, so I came across the work of Carol Churchill, who is a fantastic established playwright in the UK. And Carol has written a number of pieces of work where she's actually exploring a concept, sometimes a scientific concept, but she does it so through a theatre play. So one that I read very early on was called A Number. And A Number is all about a son who finds out that he's a clone. And so it's a two-hander play. It's between him and the father, and he's found out he's a clone. It starts there. I found that theatre was a really fascinating way in order you can bring up the ethical discussions of science in a way which was not intimidating, in a way that was actually not dictatorial. So you weren't telling people this is right and this is wrong. But also you were making a bit more sense to numbers and figures and facts and headlines. So if you look at No Planet B came out of I was finding that there was a lot of meaningful campaigns and meaningful information out there saying, look, if certain percentage increases happen to degrees, if degrees goes up by this much, entire villages are going to be underwater. These people are going to be impacted. X thing's going to happen here. B thing is going to happen there. It's going to be an absolute disaster. And there is no denying that actually we need to be absolutely careful about where our global temperatures are heading towards. But one of the things that I was quite interested in was the hysteria, and perhaps also the lack of understanding that the people who were usually writing these headlines didn't recognize perhaps that for most people a 1 degrees increase on global temperature doesn't mean much. They don't know what that actually means. I think also there was another layer to this, which was certain times it felt that in particular with climate change, there was a dominant demographic that had the luxury to be able to say, we want change around climate action. We want climate action. And I think that if we were going to be very brutally honest, there was perhaps a disparity between those people who were saying, I do not want any petrol cars, and those people were actually like, we're living in poverty and that's a priority to get us out of poverty right now. So what I want,
The inequality.
the inequality. So I mean, this is the big thing, right? Is that and this is reflected in government policy, right? Is that, do we go with all this renewable technology, or do we go getting up people out of poverty? Now you could say that both of them are mutually exclusive. You shouldn't have to pick one or another. But I certainly felt that there was perhaps a arrogant look at those people, those communities that did not get involved in climate change activism, despite the fact that they were going to be the most impacted by climate change. And so No Planet B takes the narrative of going, let's look at those communities. They are going to be impacted by climate change, but they do not have the luxury right now to go and campaign for climate action because of the world that they're living in, the experience that they have. And I thought, well, if we can create a play that just captures just a little microscopic lens into that world and show it to people who perhaps never thought about that world, then perhaps we can also frame the way that we talk about climate change, frame the way how we talk to climate change deniers, frame the way that we communicate the climate science to that community, to ourselves, to have a greater sense of impact.
And with more compassion, because also this means it's very easy to put the condemning finger to people that haven't had access, and in another societies that they have the luxury of having wasted their oil or petrol.
Yeah.
They can take freely now. We are now going to other phases, but this is not happening in some communities.
And this is absolutely critical when you understand science engagement as a whole. We do not take it for granted that we look at science in a positive light. There are certain communities that have had a history of not having the ability to see science in a positive light because of what has happened to them or how they feel it's happened. It could even just be you had a bad teacher at school. Right? It doesn't have to be that deep. And I think that is also something that we have to recognize, is that we have to meet people for where they are, not just assume that they are going to come to us and be where we need them to be. And I think that process of acknowledgement and co-creating, and that's what essentially the best form of science engagement is doing right now. It's kind of co-design and co-creating. It's not going, this is what you need to know. It's going, actually, tell us what you know already, and tell us what you want us to know, and let's build something together.
With no condemning finger.
With no condemning finger, and of course, and no judgment, I guess, essentially being able to do that.
And one other strategy that you played in this climate context has to do with the installation here.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it, because you see, you are having different strategies to communicate what is at stake nowadays and what science can tell us.
So here was a really fascinating topic, because I found that a lot of the communication that I was doing was very verbal. It was vocal. It was using words. And I thought, how can I break that? How can I go transcend the language barrier that was happening? And I came across the concept of bioacoustics through a researcher that I met at University of Sheffield. And bioacoustics is the sound of life. And the idea that you enter an ecosystem, and sometimes what these researchers do is that in order to understand which species are living there, it's very hard to go around and taking pictures of every species and look at them. They drop a microphone into that environment, and then they come back a week later or however long later, and they listen to all the recordings, and they identify the species from the sounds. And I found something very interesting in there, because I found also in the community that were the deaf community, the certain type of hearing loss is experienced, and it's not experienced immediately, it's experienced over time, which means that there's just certain frequencies that you kind of lose the ability to hear over time. And so I was like, well, there's something interesting here about environments changing and species dying and not being there anymore, and hearing leaving or hearing becoming lost, and certain frequencies not being there anymore. And I thought, well, why don't we play with this idea and go, okay, so let's look at environments around the world which are changing, have changed over the last 50 years. What did they sound like 50 years ago, 60 years ago? What do they sound like now? And let's play around with that. And I think that the juxtaposition of this project was really interesting, because the bringing together of two really stark different worlds of hearing loss and climate extinction was quite an intruding thing to do, and I think it attracted a lot of attention. But the final piece, I found, interestingly, it was such an emotional piece for so many people. So many people to come into this piece thinking that the final the third act of this piece, people walk into the room and they hear the story of a couple that grew up they lived together in a town or a city in the UK, which used to have a woodlands. And the woodlands has now grown smaller and smaller and smaller over time. And you hear the sound of the woodlands to begin with, booming life. And then towards the end, you hear the sound of a city. And that transformative journey, what only takes 5 minutes, takes you from a point in which you go, this is what the world was, to this world is now. But then it poses this question, which world do you want? Because there is still hope, that there are still reurbanization projects, there's still rewilding projects that we can do to make sure that we don't lose the world that we once had, right? And I think that's where you leave people with that question. And then what they choose to do with it is on their own accord. And I think that's, many times, sometimes, I think, getting back to school science sometimes presented the idea of the teacher must give you the answer. No, the teacher must give you the environment that you can go and find the answer for yourself. You pose the question, the Socratic reasoning, to go actually, think about it yourself, come to your own conclusion. And I think when it comes to science engagement, that's the real art. The real art is when you're able to create an environment where people are able to engage with science and come out of it and go, this is the solution that we need, which is best for us.
Yes, that's very, 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 very important. And this means also that you awaken a feeling of compassion. And in your work, you had to work in this way also, because, for example, you worked with children at their refugee camp in Calais. So let's talk about what kind of work you're doing there, because one of the words that defines you at the beginning of this interview was compassion. So let's talk about this and how compassion can make also the difference in the interaction and engagement we have with real people who are suffering. And if we have knowledge, if we have imagination, if we share beauty, there is some transformational value there.
Yeah, look, one of my great heroes, Muhammad Ali, he said that service to others is the rent that you pay for being here on earth. And I think that it's incredibly important for me that whatever I do, there is a sense of purpose, which enables the work to be supporting others. And also, I always recognize within myself that any achievements I have are, I'm grateful for God, and also grateful for the people that God placed in my life to enable me to get to where I am. But giving back to others is always quite key important. Now, the experience in the Calais refugee camp was a very emotional one, but it wasn't something that I actually intended to get the exposure that I ended up getting. I had actually just finished my undergrad at university, and the Calais refugee camp was making the news. And the unaccompanied minors in particular, so children who were in the camp, I was told about through a mutual friend of a school that he had opened up, and he was attempting to do some work with children there, so to give them some sense of familiarity in this environment they found themselves in. So it was quite an impromptu trip for me. I got on the train and head towards Dover, and went to the camp. I took some science equipment with me, nothing too major. It was like a bit of some things that I'd made at home. But when I got to the school and I started delivering these quote unquote lessons, I realized something very important, which was, as a teacher, I'd always been trained, you teach a lesson to have learning outcomes, and you then assess the children to make sure that they've learned what you've taught them, and that's success of a lesson. I learned in this particular environment that actually a science lessons outcome is not the fact that the children have learnt what gravity is. It's the ability for them to have this deep appreciation of the universe around them. But also in this particular case, it was the ability for children just to be children. And I think that was quite a key thing for me to learn, is that actually as a teacher, as a festival director, you just need to give the space for people to be who they are in the environment that you find themselves in. And so the Calais refugee camp was the takeaway I had from that was, look, there was a lot of stuff happening in the world that sometimes you don't feel that you have a power to change. But maybe you don't need to have the power to change the whole thing. You just do what you can, the small things that we all can do. And those small things that we all can do can have cascading effects. Now, I don't know the impact that I had in the small amount of time that I had in that camp. But I really hope that if I do believe, inshallah, that for those small pieces of projects that people are having across the world, those people who do make those small actions to help those in need, those people who look at the work they're doing, like in science, and go, actually, how is the work that I'm doing helping the most underserved, the most needy in society? And I would make a point here is that we often forget that maybe, just maybe, the next Nobel Prize winner, the next surgeon that's going to make the breathtaking, groundbreaking surgical advancement in human civilization, the next physicist that's going to transcend our understanding of the universe, they may be not in the high-end private schools of the world. They may be sitting in refugee camps. The experiences that those people have and what they bring to the world after those experiences, their understanding of humanity, their understanding of the world, their recognition of how knowledge is so precious, all of that will amalgamate to something that all of us can take learnings from, but also something that I remember a quote from Tony Benn, the great British politician, where he said, remember, the only thing that's making sure, and I paraphrase actually, he said, the only thing that's making you and I not be a refugee is pure luck. And when we remember that, we go, actually, all of us have a responsibility on this planet to ourselves, to the planet, but also our fellow human beings. And I come from a tradition where, you cannot be a true believer unless you love for your brother what you love for yourself. And so if I do not want any child in the world to be at a border of a nation without access to education, then what are we doing about that to address that problem? At Edinburgh Science, we're at New Horizons because we deliver a science festival in the Edinburgh City Centre. But also we have a responsibility as one of the largest science festivals in the world to go, how do we reach those communities that never even dreamed about getting into a science festival? How do we reach those children who never even thought that they can do science? How do we reach those communities that will never ever be able to step foot in Edinburgh City Centre? How do we get to those communities and ensure that they have equal, equitable, and the same access to science engagement because they deserve it as much as anyone else?
And you're talking about entanglement. You're talking about something very beautiful that maybe is depicted by the butterfly effect, in which a little wing can have a powerful effect in the atmosphere.
Yes.
But also a little wing of the thought, creative thought, can have repercussions in our ecosystems and in our planet that we don't really know. And that's why it's so important to share knowledge, to share imagination. And we thank you very much for your presence.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you ever so much. So,
muchas gracias. Y así hemos terminado un episodio más de Grandes Pensadores en TV1 con Hassun el Zafar.